We're here today with our panel of experts to discuss the far-reaching implications of the newest zero-day MOVEit. Even though patches have been released and researchers have been working around the clock since May to remediate this issue, the vulnerability will continue to wreak havoc across the internet for the foreseeable future. The scope of damage keeps growing. There are now up to 200 organizations affected. Progress, the company that owns MOVEit, has released another update, including security fixes, but experts anticipate that more victims will come forward. The education sector in particular has been hit hard. To walk you through what you expect from this zero day and what you can do, I'm pleased to introduce Marian Reed, VERSPRITE'S Vice President of our Governance, Risk, and Compliance team, Joaquin Paredes, the Director of our Offensive Security team, and Andrew Stevens, the Security Operations Manager of our Threat Intelligence Group. Welcome to all of you. In the case of the Log4j vulnerability, one of the more important lessons we learned is that there are no easy fixes for complex challenges. Only a couple of days after the official patch had been published, experts all over the world documented multiple scenarios in which remote code executions via Log4j were still viable even after the fix. We are still finding instances. In the case of this new MOVEit issue, we are still learning about the scope. So, Andrew, this is to you. Are there any known motivations or objectives behind exploiting MOVEit vulnerability?
The vast majority of the exploits that we're seeing based around this vulnerability are exfiltration of data and for ransom and sale, so profit. The initial wave of exploitations we were seeing are based around a rough affiliation of multiple threat actors called CLOP, mainly Eastern European, mainly Russian language-based criminal organizations. And kind of their de facto methodology is they steal data, usually with some pretty refined campaigns, and then either lock it down with encryption or, in this case, just say, we have it, we're going to release it for sale unless you pay us a ransom.
Thank you. All right, Marian, I'm going to move to you. What specific actions should companies utilizing MOVEit take to mitigate the risks associated with this vulnerability? Are there any temporary workarounds or patches available?
So I think first and foremost is for companies to really understand what the total impact is to them. You know, we look at, when we do assessments with companies or vendor risk assessments, we look at both the vulnerability management and the patch management. So it's really important for companies to be performing vulnerability management, running scans, so that they are aware that they're impacted by this. If a company isn't running scans very frequently, maybe every 90 days, and we've seen this in companies, they're not even going to know that they're impacted by it. So first and foremost is to make sure that you understand, am I impacted by it? What precautions do I need to take? And then the other side of that is, if I'm a company providing services, are my clients impacted? And what notification do I need to make to them as far as this particular vulnerability and it hasn't been exploited, things of that nature. So there's a lot that goes into it when you have a zero-day exploit, because it's one, understanding, have I been impacted? Two, what's been the total? Has somebody actually compromised my system based on that vulnerability?
For our clients that may be affected, what services do you offer right now to help them mitigate this? What would you suggest for companies looking to strengthen their security?
Right. So right now, I would say two key things that need a special attention. Marian already touched on one of those, patch management. So basically, right now, you guys need to patch. Once that's done, re-engage on attack surface risk management. And one of the greatest challenges of actually responding to a breach like this one is understanding what an attacker has accomplished already, if they are still active, and where they are moving next with the information that they got. So, of course, a solid detection and response program in place, I think, is crucial here. I think we'll be covering shortly about this when discussing with our T group around our VSOC program. But those are the two main things I think right now.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Marian, so how should companies assess their existing security measures and ensure that they are adequately prepared to address, mitigate, and remediate this vulnerability?
So a couple perspectives. One is just the company themselves. So again, going back to what's your vulnerability patch management policy and what's your adherence to this. Oftentimes companies have a great policy, but they're not able to get their teams to really adhere to patch management, for instance. But like I said earlier, making sure that you're doing those scans and you identify whether or not you're vulnerable. Second is, how do you identify if I've been impacted? And that's, like Wakko said, pulling up your incident response plan and really identifying, am I impacted? What's the breadth of that impact? How far have they traversed in my environment? What's the total real impact? And that's where you've got to pull your teams together under your incident response. The other component is, like I mentioned earlier, is your vendors. So we hear a lot of talk today about how critical doing vendor risk assessments, having a vendor risk management program. And that's really understanding who are your critical vendors and making sure that you have assessed them from the perspective of vulnerability management, patch management, and notification. That's really going to be key. So if you have a critical vendor that you are dependent on to provide a service that is running your revenue, and they're impacted by this, what's going to be the downstream impact to you, and how are they notifying you, and what's their business continuity plan to keep you and your services going while they're doing remediation against this vulnerability.
So are there any specific factors that make companies or industries more likely to become a target of this exploitation?
Of this, for you to be affected, you need to have been using at the time the MOVEit software, which is a file transfer and sharing suite of software. This is kind of indicative of what we call a supply chain attack, where they're not targeting your company directly, they're targeting a product or service that you're using in order to hit a wide breadth of targets. So for this particular one, if you're using Progress's MOVEit software, you're at risk. For future attacks, you just need to be very aware of your vendors and keep a close eye on what they're publishing and be up in your patching.
So how can organizations proactively use threat intelligence to defend against potential attacks and enhance their detection and response capabilities to mitigate this threat effectively? And second part of the question, do you recommend shifting to virtual SOC as it is more equipped to respond to the new threats?
That's an interesting question. With this particular attack, this is a well-known organization following tactics and techniques that are well within their wheelhouse. Threat intelligence helps you look at your specific industry, the types of actors who are targeting your industry, and those tactics, techniques, behaviors that they're known to be using, which then lets you go through your entire security architecture and model and base your defenses around that, saying, this is the software we have on hand, this is how it's being attacked, we need to be looking here, here, and here, either to prevent the initial intrusion, or once a group like this gets in and starts to try and exfiltrate your data, be specifically looking for someone and that kind of behavior so that you can stop it in progress and isolate and minimize the damage. As for virtual SOC, a virtual SOC well informed by threat intelligence and doing active threat hunting is part of that defense in depth strategy and is absolutely critical for. There are always going to be zero-day exploits, and they're hard to protect against because they're 0 days. You don't know they exist. You can keep up to date on your patches, but the patch wasn't released until this was already known and being exploited in the wild. And you can have every defense in place. It doesn't necessarily mean that your software vendors are perfect. It doesn't mean your app developers are perfect. Having someone actually keeping eyes on what's traveling across your network and what your servers are doing and what your workstations are doing and all your endpoints is critical for interrupting these attacks before they can gain foothold, stopping them, in their tracks before they can actually compromise your data, and being aware of what happens when trying to triage and do incident response after the fact.
Wakko, in your opinion, how can companies prevent this kind of issue in future?
Along with rigorously assessing the vendors that a customer use with vendor risk assessments and whatnot, organizations also need to mitigate the supply chain risks that they have that are making them vulnerable to attacks like this one that we've seen. I mean, luckily, we've seen that this attack is rather opportunistic, well, largely opportunistic, rather than being like precisely targeted against certain companies or organizations. This has gone in the wild because of this 0-day affecting the MOVEit software. But all in all, I mean, if we go back to see what actually happened, I mean, we are talking here about a SQL injection. SQL injection that is one of the oldest issues that we've known affecting web applications. So I think that this requires employing effective prevention, detection, and response technologies, which goes in line with, I was commenting before with our VERSPRITE'S program, and also performing adversarial simulation engagements, such as either red teaming or OTMs, which basically stands for organizational threat models, that reviews and put into focus of the assessment all these trust relationships that are in place from the target company that we are working with and all their third-party vendors.
So Marian, are there any recommended best practices or security controls that organizations should consider implementing?
I'm going to go back to this 3 things. Making sure that you are doing your vulnerability scans. 2, that you're adhering to your patch management policy. And 3, that you're managing your alerts, making sure that you've got the right monitoring going on in your systems, especially those critical systems. Making sure that you're getting those alerts. And now is not the time to be testing that. The time to be testing that is when you're doing the implementation of that system that's going to be monitoring your environment and making sure that you are responding to those alerts. Too often companies get inundated when they're trying to implement a security monitoring system, and they get inundated with all the alerts. They haven't gone through and done the tweaking and remove the false positives. And I think that's one of the things that when you look to go to a third party to do your VSOC for you, it's a huge gain for a company, because a company like ours, we've already done that. We know what the critical alerts are. We're on top of it. So there's a lot to be gained by outsourcing the SOC operations. So I think that would be a critical component. You got to be monitoring, you got to be on top of it.
And the final question for you today is regarding threat intelligence sharing and collaboration. Are there any reliable information sharing initiatives or platforms where organizations can stay updated on the latest developments related to the MOVEit vulnerability?
To me, the most important thing is be aware of your tech stack and be aware of what software you're using and depend on, and look at those publishers. All of these software providers publish updates on software patches, security vulnerabilities that are going out. And you can't just be looking at the main ones. Microsoft does an amazing job, but as we're seeing with these supply chain attacks, sometimes it's your enterprise resource management software or your file transfer software. Once there's a threat in the wild, one of my favorite places to look is the Internet Storm Center from the SAMS Institute. They have a very good daily podcast that kind of gives you a quick rundown of what's out there, as well as the what does the acronym stand for? CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, has regular bulletins that really help show you what are some of the most important things to be focusing on. What are the big events that are going down? And that'll help you act instead of react and just be chasing the news cycle.
Is there anything that you want to say to wrap up?
What's most important in security? We tend to get caught up in 0 days because they're flashy. What's most important is hygiene. Eating your Wheaties, doing the basic work, keeping up with your patches, keeping a good baseline of what's supposed to be traveling across your network to look for strange user behavior, traffic that shouldn't be there, people accessing things they shouldn't. One thing that struck me is the types of data that was exfiltrated in this attack was limited to what was on those file shares. If you control your crown jewels and make sure that there's not data being put where it's not supposed to be, that stuff is on a need to know, well segregated and planned, you're going to limit your damage quite a bit.
What are the potential consequences for companies that fail to address the MOVEit vulnerability? Are there any regulatory or legal implications that organizations need to be aware of in case they have been breached?
Definitely. So multiple perspectives on that front. You've got federal regulations, depending on the industry that you are in. If you're a healthcare company, if you're a financial company, if you're a public company, there are SEC requirements as far as notification. And then every state just about has implemented some type of privacy law about notification if personal data has been implicated. So there are a lot of regulations, a lot of laws out there that organizations need to be aware of if they've been impacted by this vulnerability.
Are there any final thoughts or anything else that you want to say to wrap up to let our viewers know?
You know, one thing I would say is security is, and I think Wakko mentioned this earlier, when we think about our security programs and trying to measure ourselves, where are we? How mature are we? Are we mature enough to really address and manage a situation if I were to be hit by this vulnerability? It goes back to making sure that you understand your organization. And threat modeling is really a good way to approach security. We all look at frameworks, we all look at regulations, and we kind of go through and do the check the box. But at the end of the day, you're not really secure if you don't understand your threats. So building your security program around your threats and then mirroring that up with a framework or regulation or both, that gets you a great security program. And I think if you were to take both of that into account and then come back and measure yourself and your maturity, I think you would find that your maturity is much further along because you've taken both into account, not just done check the box based on a framework.
Wakko, do you have anything to add?
No, I totally agree with Marian here. That's why I was mentioning the organizational threat model approach, trusting the PASTA framework to dissect and understand and go deep into understanding what's on the table, what's the footprint, what are the things that we need to protect, and what are the things that are out there. I mean, as I was saying before, this is an SQL injection that could be exploited. I mean, if you had the MOVEit software on-prem exposed to the internet, I mean, that's definitely one asset that you should have taken account of when it comes to the things that you need to protect.
That is what I have for today. And just one note to our viewers as well. Well, we know that hearing about a threat like this is very stressful, but just understand that VERSPRITE is here to help. If you have questions or need guidance about the MOVEit vulnerability or anything else, please feel free to reach out. And Marian and Wakko are always here to help and serve you.